Hi, welcome to Susan Stanley Stitch in Time. I'm so pleased you're joining me today, and if it's your first time, welcome. On this channel, I like to talk about cross-stitch, quilting, textiles, and sewing notions from the past, and I like to share with you the progress on my projects. So today, on this episode, I'm going to answer some comments and questions. We're going to take a look at this quilt behind me. I'm going to share the progress on my projects. I have a finish, a quick summary of Sampler Symposium, and some new acquisitions. Let's look at the questions. I love it when you send comments, and I love it when you ask questions. And I do my best to do the research to give you the most accurate answer I can. The first question I received was from a viewer, and I thought this was a really excellent question. She said that in an effort to be authentic and recreating an antique sampler, how is it that stitchers are choosing fairly pricey silks that would not have been available to children at the time? Well, actually, this is a really good question, and it gets into a lot of history of textile development. And until the Industrial Revolution, cotton was not available for embroidery. Silk, linen, and wool were the only threads that were used. So a child would go to school to obtain instruction, and their teacher would give them a beautiful piece of linen and the threads that they had available to use. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later when I share a project, but thank you for asking that question, because it really is, we don't really understand the past, and it definitely would be confusing. We have an embarrassment of riches today. We have so much available to us, and it was very limited. It was much more limited prior when many of these samplers were stitched. Another question, which I thought was excellent, she said she wondered why I began using a hoop and why I was using the stab method. I don't know if I like that name for it, but I'll go with it. So prior to this time, I had been using the sewing method. I'm an appliquer, I'm a quilter. It was very comfortable for me. Well, I began the Simple Harmonies box, which is an instructed project that Katie Strachan offers on her FlossTube channel, Katie Strachan Embroidery. And in her videos, she highly recommends using a hoop to stabilize the linen and the threads. This project that you stitch is going to be adhered to a wooden box, and the dimensions have to stay exact. So when you use the stab and poke method, you aren't stretching any bias on the linen, you aren't distorting any of the fibers. Things are much more stable than the scooping or sewing method. And for this project, I was going to do whatever she said, because I've never made anything to glue onto a box, and I'm terrified of gluing it, so I wasn't going to mess around. I do also think at some point I will probably end up using a stand and trying the two-handed stitching method. That'll come later, but this is part of my stitching journey. So thank you so much for asking that question. I also had somebody ask me where I got my hoop. The hoops are available, the Hardwick Manor hoops that I use, and I'll show it to you later, is available at the Attic Needlework. I just saw them there. I believe they're also available at Hobby House, at Needle in a Haystack, and possibly other places that I don't know of, but at least those will get you started. Maybe even hoop and frame. It's a great hoop. I have the same brand for my quilting. I can't recommend it enough. It's beautiful, beautiful. The next question was, oh, and what I wanted to say is I'm going to start a hashtag called Hoops Save Hands, because I can't tell you the relief that using this hoop has given my arthritis. For those of you who aren't there yet with arthritis, just know if you do a lot of handwork, it might be coming your way. All right, next question. What should I use for marking the label on my quilts? I've been talking a lot about labeling and documenting my work, and that includes adding a fabric label to the back of my quilts. The best pen that I know, if you're going to, some people embroider their labels. I don't. I would probably never get them done. So I use a pen, and I use this pen called the IdentiPen. Move my face out of the way. I will link this information below. It comes in black and the sepia tone. You have a sharp point and a wider point. The color does not fade. It does not bleed on the fabric. If you iron a piece of freezer paper on the back of your label fabric before you start writing to stabilize it, and if you have something that you can, a light box that you can write your label out on and then look through to transfer it or trace it, you should have great success with this pen. Now, let me tell you what never, ever, ever to use. Do not ever use a Sharpie. It will bleed, it will run. If you wash your quilt, it will go all over. Never use a Sharpie. The tulip fabric marker is great when you're sending your kid off to camp and you need to write their initials in their neck, but it is disastrous for a label. It also bleeds and spreads. It looks terrible. The Pigma, the Micron Pigma, is not a bad option, but this ink fades. I haven't had total success with this ink long term. So thank you for that question. I hope that helps. All right. This quilt behind me, last time I had a kind of a loud, screaming, crazy, bold quilt, the 1876 Centennial quilt. This time I have a quilt. This is my own design. This quilt is based around a block called the Birds in the Air block, and I'm going to put a picture in right here of that block just all by itself. So as you can see, that block is comprised of half square triangles. If you know, if you're a quilter, you know what that is, and put together and then making a larger half square triangle. Now this block dates back to about 1830 to 1860, and it was actually a block that was an abolitionist block. It was also called Flying Geese, and it was a statement of an anti-slavery block that people should be free. There's a lot of significance to that block. I also like birds, so it kind of ties into that. And I was exploring again this 1840s time period, and I wanted to reproduce something or create something and interpret something that I could encapsulate that time period. So this quilt has fabrics that I believed at the time were good reproductions from around 1830, 1840. It's very scrappy, and what I mean by that is it uses a variety of fabrics, not a ton of repeats, much more soft palette, much softer palette. It's calming, it's peaceful, it's hand quilted. The border is a chintz bird, and if you've been quilting any time in the recent years, you'll know that recognize that as a Joe Morton fabric. which was classic from 1830s, 1840s, in that, somewhere around in there. This quilt, I probably would have done a few things differently. If I was doing it today, I probably would have added embroidery purse, which was very common during that time. And I might have changed the sashing fabric. But, you know, this quilt sits at the foot of my bed. I have a king size bed. It kind of drapes on the diagonal over the edge. It's got a wool batting and it's hand quilted. It keeps my feet nice and warm. And it's just a calming, peaceful quilt. I enjoyed making it. I enjoy using it. And I wanted to share it with you. As a result of looking at this 1830s time period, 1840s time period, I've been really thinking about how did people get access to the supplies that they used? How did somebody during that time period get the products they needed for stitching or for quilting? Products were difficult to obtain, especially textiles, and pins, needles, and textiles. All of these commodities were precious. They were scarce. They were valuable. So and prior to this, the importance of a scrap bag was paramount. Every household, save none, even, I don't know, maybe there were some out there, but I can't imagine every household was saving their textile scraps. They were reusing their textiles. They were taking dresses and cutting them down for another body, size, shape, style, refitting them for the current fashion. And the fabrics that were used to cut up a dress, any scraps were put into a work basket. So every household, from what I can tell, and of course there's always exceptions, had a work basket and a scrap basket. And these textiles were part of that. So when I made this quilt, I had that in mind, of a scrap basket, of maybe a leftover sleeve or a part of a sleeve cut up into blocks and squares to make a quilt. So I want to tell you and show you some examples of how yardage was sold in the 1800s up until this time period. And this piece of fabric right here is actually an antique piece of chintz that I purchased. It's been dated between 1810, 1830. It's just gorgeous. And fabric was hand woven, hand loomed until the Industrial Revolution. And fabric was sold by yardage ranging from 10 to 22 yards, depending on what was fashionable to make a dress. And this piece of fabric actually measures 28 inches wide from selvage to selvage. And I just want to show you the selvage on this because it's printed come all the way up to the edge of the selvage, and you can see that tightly woven edge. And then you go across. And I'm gonna share some of this with you because it is just so pretty. So this was likely used for a drapery. It was a dress. It's just beautiful. And you can see, it is inked all the way through, but not quite as bold on the back. Just beautiful. So because of the hand loom being limited by its width, fabric was not as wide, and when the Industrial Revolution hit, fabric began to be woven mechanically by machines, and it could be accommodate a much wider piece. And so this, in the 1930s, fabric was about 36 inches wide. This piece of fabric, which you will recognize the designer there, Joe Morton. This fabric is from the early 2000s, like 2010, I think. And you can see that the selvage has is dyed. It's dyed all the way up to the edge. And the selvage is pretty narrow. All right, and so a new thing has happened in the recent years of the 2000s. Fabric has now become branded. It's 45 inches wide. That last piece I showed you was also 45 inches wide and actually usable up almost up to the edge. Now you can see the selvage has the name, the fabric company, the pattern number, the number of colors. And selvages, you know, have become quite popular to be used in projects as well. It tells you the name of the fabric. It's just become a wealth of information right there on the edge of your fabric. Although it cuts off a few inches of use. So just something new that I thought you would be interested in. So as I've told you before, I'm trying to be really deliberate this year, and I'm keeping records of the floss and the linen that I use, finding that happy combination. This book is actually, I'm surprised at how much I'm going back to it. I'm writing down what needle works best for the linen and the floss combination. I think this is going to be something that I'm really glad I did. So my first project that I worked on, and I wanted to have done by now, but I'm not quite there, is Mary Snow. She was so fun to work on. You know, the holidays were busy. Then I went to Sampler Symposium, but I have made a bit of progress. She's such a darling stitch. I just love her. And I'm using a Vera Soie, and I'm using Lakeside Light Exemplar 40 count. And that seems to be a good combination. I'm happy with the coverage on that. It is a little bit easier now that I'm using a hoop actually to get into those tight spaces on things like this. But yeah, she's so cute. I really love that parrot. And the next project is Hannah Lancaster, and I am, like I've said, I'm focusing on 1840 this year. I'm really diving into that time period with things that I read and things that I'm stitching. And so Hannah Lancaster is from 1840. Of course, what's not to love? The house and a girl. It's not a red house, but I love that house, even though it's full of brick. This is actually in a museum. It's in the Worcester Art Museum in Massachusetts. And someday I hope to get there and see it. So you might be surprised to see that the folio maker actually has her first folio. This is going to be our next release. It's you're getting a sneak peek, but I've got my 103s in here, and that's what I'm stitching Hannah on. However, as I started stitching her, and you can see here, I was stitching her on 38 count. And if you know Legacy Linen, and this is something I'm keeping track of in my book, Legacy Linen has its colors named and count have different names. So this is 40 count Fuller's Teasel. I ordered some 45 count Foxtail Millet. It's the same color, and I'm going to try that to see if I'm happier with the coverage. I feel like this is just a tiny bit light and airy for me, and you know, in the past I probably would have plowed through, but I'm really trying to be thoughtful and deliberate. So I'm going to give it another go and just compare and see what I like better. So Hannah has been a fun thing to work on. I'm going to show you close up so you can see the coverage. You know, it's really personal preference. And I had done some sample coverage patches down here. It just wasn't extensive enough. I really needed to go for it. That is Hannah. All right. My other 1840s stitch is Mary Brutnell. And I'm stitching Mary Brutnell with Goblins. Now I am missing several of the colors, and they are on their way. I think actually just the blue, actually the red and the green. But isn't that pretty? I am enjoying stitching with Goblins. It's a different feel. It's a lot like stitching with the silk thread. If you do any kind of handwork with silk, it does have the twist. You do have to pull it and kind of hold it into place. But let me show you what I've done so far. It's not a ton. I'm doing this on 30 count Mariner's Map. And I'm just getting the framework. Now, earlier I addressed a question about schoolgirl samplers and floss that would have been used. I'm trying 30 count and the Goblins because I wanted to try something as close to what would have been available back in the 1840s as possible. And so if a schoolgirl was given her linen and her threads in school, this is close to what she would have received. And she probably would have had a choice in the threads that she picked. I mean, that's why we see all these fun colors. And as far as I know from what I've read and what I've heard, that's how it was done. There, you know, the big difference is that in 1840, 1830, things were still hand woven, and there was no linen that had the same number of warp and weft threads. So the warp might be 65 and the weft might be 54 or 38, 45. And it was an evolving thing. And even up until 1840, most linen was still hand woven. So I am, you know, I'm enjoying that stitch. I really am. It's, you know, sometimes hard to go between different thread counts, but I'm trying to limit my projects a little bit. The next thing I want to show you is progress on, I just started another block for Civil War Bride. I'm really excited because I am going to New York for the Prim Needle Arts seminar. They've asked me to speak, and that is in October of this year. And afterwards, I'm going to do some hunting around New York. I'm going to go to the American Folk Art Museum, and this quilt is there. And so I am so excited to get to see it in real life. I like to, I don't know if I've shown you this, I think I may have, but I like to, when I have a long-term project, a quilting project, I kit it up and I make something fun that's going to be easily accessible to me when I'm stitching. So this is kind of my Civil War Bride box. These are my threads. I have my clover needle holder. I have my little box for, oh boy, what do I have? Pins. I have thimble pads, my thread waxer, my eyeglass wiper, got a pin cushion. So that's what I like to do. And so far this has been hanging out for over a year, so it was worth making. All right, so if you do applique, you know that when you start an applique block, it's not always pretty. So this is the block I'm working on, and this is actually the pattern. This is what you get, and then it's up to you to applique it as you wish. So right now the first step is to applique the stems, and you can see they look like big ugly blobs, but these ones have been appliqued down on both sides. And I've shown you before that I take a larger piece and I applique one side, and then I trim back the other side and applique it with needle turn. So not super pretty, but it's well on its way. It's almost like chipping a diamond out of a rock, because the farther you go with it, the more beautiful it becomes. You don't use a hoop for applique. I think somebody asked me that. It would be really, really difficult, and there's really no need. Fabric, because thread is more stable than fabric. Fabric has the bias. You can turn this and manipulate it to go however you'd like. Now, you do have to pin things so that you aren't stretching and pulling and ending up with these big pleated tucks, but that is one difference. I'm always reading, and I finished Embroidering Her Truth, and so, which was the kind of historical account of Mary, Queen of Scots needlework. So I jumped over to this book by Margaret Swain, The Needlework of Mary, Queen of Scots. And it's a fascinating read. It's an earlier time period than I typically study, but I'm curious and I'm interested. I'm very, very intrigued by the materials and what was used during that time. This has just been really interesting. And her needlework is not perfect, but it's elegant and it's very compelling. So if that interests you, I would recommend getting this book. This very good information. Of course, now I want to go over to Europe and see all her needlework in person. I'm also reading this book, Buying into the World of Goods, Early Consumers in Backcountry Virginia. And it sounds kind of maybe stale, but it's actually really interesting. And it's how goods and commodities were traded and how people accessed things in those early years of the 1800s in the United States of America. So it's fascinating. Of course, I'm reading it because it ties into textiles and how textiles were brought from other countries and other regions to where people could use them. So I just find it a very good book. Very good. And then last of all, I recently acquired this book, Lavish Legacies, and it is a bit about the Baltimore album quilts. And Baltimore album quilts are something that I'd like to talk about at some point, but they're just beautiful little snippets of early American history. 1850s was kind of their heyday. It's a little bit later than the time period that I'm really focusing on, but you can see lots of red and green, which I love, and just a very unique form of art was taking place during that time period in Baltimore, and a lot of history behind why these quilts were being made, what their purpose was. Just so I'm always curious and interesting, and of course looking for information on that. I have a finish that I'd like to share with you. It's kind of my own original. The quilt block is actually not my own original block, but this layout is my own original layout and the color scheme, and I'm calling it Winter Trees. This is what I see when I look out my windows these days up here in the Pacific Northwest. Is there are still lots of evergreens, but there are a lot of trees with no leaves, and I just found this to be a really peaceful palette to work with. I love these soft browns. I've wanted to play around with them for quite some time. I like to mix, dots and stripes and all kinds of pattern. And this just is out on, we have an old trunk that's next to our couch, and I just lay this over on it. Kind of add some ambiance to the winter scene at our house. Probably one of my favorite fabrics is this one here by Betsy Chutchin. It's an Eliza's Indigo fabric, and I just love all the little tiny picotage dots in the background. They just add so much interest to that. And then if you know me, and if you've ever taken a class from me, you know that I always am messing around, so I had to make a pin cushion. Now this is still loaded with the pins, but this is a miniature tree. This is a 3 or 4 inch size adaptation of that. Shrunken down. Actually, I keep this in my applique box. This is my favorite pin cushion go-to. So it's all loaded up and ready to go. I have a few new acquisitions I want to share with you. I was so lucky and thankful to be gifted this beautiful set, and I used it at Sampler Symposium. Now this is the Kiwana product. It's really gorgeous Italian leather, but really my main purpose was I wanted, because I've become really attached to my little hoop, I wanted something to carry my hoop in, and this seemed to fit the bill. So I have this lovely set. I'm still working on the insides of this, making it all just right, but oh, that was some lovely acquisition. I purchased some Liberty of London fabric, and I was visiting my family in San Diego. I went into Joann's, oddly enough, for another reason, and lo and behold, this Liberty of London fabric was there, and it was on sale. And besides it being absolutely gorgeous and fun and lawn quality, and what I mean by that is the width and the hand of it, it is printed all the way up to the edge. So they are still printing their fabric all the way up to the edge at Liberty of London. This will be lovely for, well, I have a couple things in mind, but probably more clothing related than project, but anyway, so pretty. Look at this. Look at the cute little graphics on this. I don't know, maybe a pin cushion, who knows. So that came home with me. I was, of course, antiquing with my sister. I showed some of you some pictures on Instagram, and I found this really interesting thread holder, and I thought, wow, I could sit this next to my stitching chair, and I've got my Gobelins set up in there right now. I could put 103s. Look at how many spools it holds. You can collapse one side and just have it kind of like a ladder. I don't really know the date on it. My sister did not know either. I don't think it's super old, but I think it's really cool. This would easily fit down into a sewing basket. Anyway, I thought it was something fun and a bit practical as well. So that came home with me. And then when I was at the attic, I was so fortunate to be there when Dawn was rolling out her new fabulous book on sewing rolls, needle rolls, and huswifts. This is an incredible collection of these beautiful textiles that were used. And I can't wait to dive into this and really read. I've enjoyed her other book, Antique Needlework Tools, American Antique Needlework Tools. So this also came home with me and is going into my library. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been my winter chronicle of my travels and the treasures I brought back. I also wanted to mention Sampler Symposium. I posted a video with some lovely people who also attended, who were willing to sit down with me and talk about their experiences. I hope you'll pop over and look at that. I know so many people have talked about the symposium, and there really is not a whole bunch more that I can add. It was phenomenal. The speakers were top-notch. The projects were phenomenal. It was a wonderful experience, and I hope if you can't attend that you will feel part of it by watching my other video. and I hope that you enjoy seeing the projects that everyone is showing. They were really special. Next, I have been asked to do a hand piecing tutorial, and so that will be coming up soon. I've got that in the works. I'm excited. A lot of people are interested in this other form of stitching, and I will be back. My next video is a special one. It will be my 2-year floss tube anniversary, so I hope to do something special for that. I will see you soon, and in the meantime, make time for stitching. Bye-bye. I want to give you a little bit of a kind of a panorama of the quilt. I don't know if you noticed, but some of the blocks are scrappy, and I think adding a little bit of unusual surprise in some of the blocks makes it kind of fun.